Penguin Random House Audio presents The Betrothed, a novel by Alessandro Manzoni, translated by Michael F. Moore, prefaced by Jhumpa Lahiri, read for you by Ari Fliakos, with a preface read by Susan Vinciotti Bonito.
Preface by Jhumpa Lahiri. I attended my first Italian wedding in the seaside town of Sestri Levante, on the Ligurian coast. The bride, who lived in Brooklyn in those days as I did, was my Italian tutor. Her family hosted us warmly, and on the last day we spent together, before my own family and I were headed back to the airport in Genoa, they organized a final, intimate lunch with the newlyweds. In the affectionate confusion of saying goodbyes, the bride's mother ran into a bookstore and placed a tome in my hands. It was a paperback copy of I Promessi Sposi. Given that her daughter was teaching me Italian, she must have felt inspired to introduce me to Italy's most celebrated novel, all 582 pages of it, in its original form. I was touched by her faith in me. Back then, I considered reading and understanding a short story in Italian a major accomplishment. That was in August of 2010. 10 years would pass before I opened the book, one cold January day in Princeton, New Jersey, and devoured it to the end in a burst of unabated enthusiasm. Of course, I had tried to read it right away, as soon as I returned to Brooklyn after my tutor's wedding. But even setting aside the staggering number of pages, Manzoni's language was beyond me, and I knew that I was barely scratching the surface of what he was saying. To help things along, I procured a version of the book in English, The Betrothed. Unfortunately, I found the translation underwhelming and nearly as impenetrable. I read a few chapters before abandoning it. When I moved to Italy, most of my friends groaned at the memory of having to slog through it in high school. None of the writers I befriended in Rome spoke about it much, perhaps because it was already a hallowed part of their collective consciousness. But my inability to reckon with Manzoni, in either English or in Italian, gnawed at me. And so I was thrilled when, in 2015, I learned that Michael Moore was at work on a new English version. Michael, if I refer to him by first name, it is due to our friendship, had previously translated two of my most beloved authors, Alberto Moravia and Primo Levi. And reading his translations had motivated me to form intense relationships with both Moravia and Levi in Italian. He was the person I turned to, and still do, when I had questions about anything pertaining to contemporary Italian literature in translation. I was aware of his years of service on the translation committee of PEN, the many years he lived in Italy, and the perfect and completely natural Italian which I longed to speak myself. He had a polyhedric, erudite understanding of Italian history and the Italian language. He had written his doctoral dissertation on Petrarch, but was also fluent in Italian popular culture, Italian as it is spoken on the streets, Italian slang. I found his work as an interpreter for the permanent mission of Italy to the United Nations utterly fascinating. If anyone could accomplish the Herculean feat of transforming Manzoni's masterpiece into an English that was as bracing and engaging as the original, it was he. In 2016, when I taught my first translation workshop at Princeton University, I invited Michael to speak to my students about his experience of translating Manzoni. We compared the same chapter, one translated by Michael, the other by one of his predecessors. We spoke about how his translation in progress grabbed and shook us, banging its fist on the table as opposed to granting an affable nod. Over the years, he returned twice more to visit my Princeton classes, to speak to different groups of students, always about Manzoni. Each time, the chapters he shared felt more supple, increasingly vital. My students were always delighted to listen to him impart all manner of practical and philosophical advice about the art and craft of translation. He inspired them, just as he has inspired me to translate. He is an example of how love for another language and another culture can fulfill and revolutionize one's life. It has been both a privilege and a distinct pleasure to witness the lengthy, assiduous gestation of Michael's translation of The Betrothed. Over the years, he sent me emails from Zurich, Milan, and the shores of Lake Como. These last two locations serve, of course, as key settings for the novel, with updates on the state of the translation. We spoke of its methodical metamorphosis in person one summer in Rome, when he was working at a library in the Jewish ghetto, and over the phone when he was in New York, juggling his formidable responsibilities as an interpreter. I have followed the evolution of this translation from the early chapters he shared with my students to the ones that, at the time of this writing, are undergoing copy editing. I have watched him stand before two huge computer screens, translating literally on his feet, when he was Princeton's translator in residence in the spring of 2018. Throughout this process, I was amazed by his endurance and his dedication to the task. I can no longer count the number of times I asked him, "Come va, Manzoni?" How goes, Manzoni? And he replied, "Ci siamo quasi. I'm getting there." The fact that he has indeed gotten there, and that his masterful translation of The Betrothed is now in print, is a landmark literary occasion. You may be asking why I have chosen to begin my preface to Manzoni's great novel with a paean to its most recent English translator. But I suspect that Manzoni would have wanted it this way. For the story of Moore's epic translation, arduous, intense, and also itinerant, mirrors the basic plot of the novel. Moreover, I regard Manzoni, who went through the back-breaking effort of rewriting his entire book in Tuscan dialect, even though it had already met with considerable popular and critical success upon its original publication in 1827, as a species of translator himself. In converting his work from one idiom to another, he was essentially self-translating. This feat took him 13 years. Manzoni fully deserves his place as Italy's first and finest novelist. But he was also, in equal parts, a philologist who wrote essays on language, vocabulary, and the increasingly pressing question of what was to become unified Italy's national tongue. Not surprisingly, speech and communication are among the novel's principal themes. Manzoni's sole purpose in reworking his text and unburdening it of regional inflections was to alter and update it linguistically, to make it more readable by rendering it less stuffy and stilted, more accessible and fresh. Michael Moore's own unremitting objective to modernize Manzoni, and thereby to render this classic work of Italian literature sprightly and contemporary, mirrors the drama that underlines the final apotheosis of the original novel. How has he done this? Here is not the place to pit one translation against another. That exercise appropriate in the classroom is illuminating for those who wish to analyze the infinitely debatable and mysterious inner workings of shifting from one language to another. I can vouch, having first fully appreciated Manzoni in Italian, then having turned to the present English translation, that the thrill has not been lost in translation. If anything, for the reader who loves both languages, it has only doubled. Michael often used an Italian expression to describe the type of work he was doing, da certosino. This refers to the minute, patient work undertaken by the Carthusians, a hermetic order of monks founded by Bruno of Cologne in 1084 in the valley of Chartreuse, near Grenoble, France. The Latin motto of the Carthusians, Stat crux dum volvitur orbis means the crux.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?